Lapped seam. Certain seams are ideal for certain fabrics, just as the lapped seam is perfect for bulkier fabrics like leather and felt. And it is this lapped seam that we are going to learn in this class. Objectives: at the end of the class, you will be able to identify a lapped seam. So, a lapped seam. What is a lapped seam? This is what the lapped seam looks like. Lapped seams are typically used for bulky materials that do not ravel, such as leather and felt. Let's see how to do the lapped seam on a sample. The procedure of sewing the lapped seam. You will need the following items to do this sample: fake leather, straight ruler, pattern square, straight pins, measuring tape, tailor's chalk, shears, a pair of small scissors, contrasting thread, iron, sewing machine. Now let's begin. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fake leather pieces. At the outset, take 2 layers of fake leather. Measure and draw 10-inch by 10-inch square on it with the help of a ruler, pattern square, measuring tape, and a tailor's chalk. Using the shears, cut the marked squares. Step 2. Mark the seam allowance. Now take one of the leather pieces and lay it on the table with its right side up. Using a pattern square, measuring tape, and tailor's chalk, mark a 1/2-inch seam allowance along one of its cut edges. Step 3. Trim the second piece and pin the 2 pieces together. Mark and trim the same amount as a seam allowance from the second piece. Lap the trimmed second piece over the first fabric square along the drawn seam line. Hold it in place with straight pins or hand basting. Step 4. Stitch the seam. Now we will start stitching. Press the reverse stitch lever and start with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Stitch the cut edge about 1/8 inch away from the edge with a normal stitch length going through both upper and lower layer. Again, press the reverse stitch lever and end with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Snip the thread and remove the straight pins. Step 5. Sew a second line of stitching. Make parallel seam 1/4 inch to the first one and again going through both layers. Snip the thread with a pair of small scissors. Finally, you have your sample with a lapped seam ready. Please note, here we are using a contrasting thread for demonstration purposes only, so that it is visible, but otherwise one would use a thread matching the fabric. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned in this class. Lapped seams are typically used for bulky materials that do not ravel, such as leather and felt. The procedure of sewing the lapped seam, let's review its basic steps. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fake leather pieces. Step 2. Mark the seam allowance. Step 3. Trim the second piece and pin the two pieces together. Step 4. Stitch the seam. Step 5. Sew a second line of stitching. This is the lapped seam. So now you have learned all about the lapped seam. Take our next class to learn about the supporting seam techniques.